Okay, so understanding Celtic gods. So as Julie mentioned, I've done a few of these understanding gods talks. I think some of you have been to some before. I've done the Egyptians and Greeks and all sorts of things. So this is. It seems right to come back to our own country to try and find out what was going on here before the Romans, before Christianity, and to try and sort of reclaim some of our own old deities, because they're so vague and in the midst of time they're lost to us really. And I think it's a tragedy that we know more about Egyptian and Greek gods than about gods of Britain. In my research I keep coming across these little guys who are absolutely brilliant, and I just think they're absolutely fascinating, and we'll talk about them a bit more later on, but they're the cuculati, the little cloaked dwarves. So these are, again, sort of mystic little figures that pop up in British museums that people know very little about. So we're going to explore, who are the Celts, evidence for and nature of Celtic religion, the Celtic festival year, Welsh and Irish pantheons, and when you look at, there are over 400 Celtic gods that we know of. So we're not going to be doing all of them today. 14 we're going to manage today, more or less. So we have to understand, first of all, who the Celts were. And I think they probably didn't call themselves Celts, although Julius Caesar and the Greeks seem to think that they did. So if you look at, obviously everyone knows Gaul, that France was named Gaul or Gallia. And then you've got Galicia, Gallia Cisalpine, Galati and Galatia. These are all areas where the culture was quite similar. But can you see that the Gal part there? You know Gaelic in Scotland. So I feel that this was actually Gal. They called themselves Galts. It doesn't sound like Celts, but it probably sounded something similar, like Gal, something like that. So it doesn't really matter what they called themselves so much. It's to do with a sort of a shared culture, some shared deities that have similar names, shared practices, shared way of thinking about the world. This is what unites these people, but we can't say that they shared absolutely everything, because we're talking about small different tribes across this landscape that had lots of idiosyncratic features of their own, but they had a few shared features. So sometimes we use Celts as a broad blanket term and say that they're all exactly identical, but you must understand that they all weren't. It's like people in the Roman Empire. They might have all called themselves Romans, but the Roman part of them might have been quite small, whereas their own national identity was much stronger. And there's been recent evidence, which I'm quite interested in looking at it. They talk about that where did the Celts come from? They often talk about Latin culture, so in a sense of it's spreading out from that particular location, and that being the heartland of Celtic culture. But there's actually new evidence that is trying to talk about it coming from Portugal, but then that's recently been trumped by it coming actually from Britain, which is even more interesting, coming out of Britain and spreading out that way. And of course, what we got really was when the Saxons came in and pushed the Celtic world back to its fringes, behind the mountains, really, wasn't it? Into Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, that have held on to that sort of Celtic understanding of the sort of identity, and of course Ireland as well. But England, even though we have the richest Iron Age finds and Bronze Age finds to a certain degree, which relate to Celtic culture, we've completely stamped out absolutely everything that in our national memory. But the Welsh and the Cornish haven't. They have a very strong sense of identity separate to England, very very much so. It's all bound up in language, and when you start to look at language and the Celtic language, the similarities between what they were speaking in north of Gaul and Belgium, Ireland, there are certainly shared features, and you can equate them. Anyway, all very interesting, but we have to think about how do we know about Celtic religion and Celtic gods, what evidence is there? And it's an interesting starting point, because when you think about why do we know so much about Egyptian and Greek religion and not about the Celtic religion, are there any thoughts on that? That's right. Well, it was an oral culture over here. They didn't write. It wasn't. There weren't people who wrote. So when you write stuff down in copious amounts, like the Greeks and Egyptians and all the rest of it, there's so much there that we can access and tap into. And it's all there for us to see exactly what they thought about their gods, who their gods were. They're extremely well recorded. Whereas in the Celtic world, it was an oral culture and it was not at all recorded. So that makes things very difficult for us, and that's why we don't have that kind of memory of them as much. But we do have some evidence, and some of the key evidence is in Roman inscriptions. So when we get the meeting of the Roman world with the Celtic world, then we start to have some Celtic divinities named for us in their altar inscriptions and other. Actually, they are always in altar inscriptions. So that one's Dei Coventinae, which is the goddess Coventina, who is from the northeast of Britain. She's associated with a particular well site at Hadrian's Wall, at Caerleon. So we know about her and her shrine. It's just because of this inscription. So that's really valuable for us. And then the other sources we have are sources of myth that were written down by Christian scholars and writers in the later times, but they do harken back and talk about myths that we might be able to dig out deities via those myths. So obviously the key Welsh text is the Mabinogion, and there are lots of key Irish texts. Tembo Cooley, which means the cattle raid of Cooley, and Lebo Gabala, the Book of Invasions. They're the key books for the Irish gods. And then there are quite a lot of tales that are Brittonic, which talk about King Arthur. And this is another thing that I didn't know myself. I mean, I obviously thought, you know about the Geoffrey de Monmouth version of the Arthurian legends and on Chrétien de Troyes and all the rest of it, but it's I didn't know there was such richness in the Welsh Mabinogion. They really do claim Arthur as their own, and he plays a part in most Welsh myths. And then King Arthur was doing this, and all the other gods come in and help him and things like this. So they have a very rich tradition of Arthurian tales. And if you're a fan of Arthur, the Mabinogion is a really super read. But there are problems with those texts. All sources have problems really when they're recording something that's so far after the time of their existence, and also from a through a Christianizing lens, in terms of making them moral tales, different kinds of tales. So we have tales in the Mabinogion of Welsh princes, for example, the prince Pwyll or Pwyll going into the underworld for a year and a day and sleeping with the god of the underworld's wife, the queen, and not touching her. He was so chaste at all, and he came back after a year and a day, and then they exchanged places again, and his wife goes, "Oh, you want to touch me now, do you?" And he goes, "Oh, it wasn't me." She goes, "That bloke, he was so chaste." Oh, he was a real paragon of chastity. And I'm thinking, in the Celtic, in the original sort of story, I'm sure that wasn't the case. But yeah, sometimes you just don't know what's the little grain of truth and the nuggets of truth in all these stories. But by truth, I mean original Celtic tales, as it were. So we're thinking about some of the problems. So let's think about the problems with the Roman altars. So what might be the limitations of learning about Celtic gods from those altars? Any thoughts?
Surely they would have been Romanised. Well, they would have tried to absorb the local culture and then gently twist it into something that's acceptable to both, because they've come in to conquer.
Yeah, and in fact that process is called syncretization, and the Romans had a little phrase, well, it was interpretatio Romana, which means when you go into a new culture, you look at their system of gods and go, okay, what is that god like in our in our pantheon? Oh, he's a bit like our Mars, and they try to match up the deities with the Roman deities, and they conflated them quite often. So quite often we lose the Celtic god's name, and it is sort of overwritten by Mars or something like that. Or sometimes we might have a little epithet at the end of Mars, which tells us, refers to an older god or a Celtic god. So they sort of run these gods together. But that's quite often is overwriting some of the original aspects or focuses of that particular deity. So I find that the Celtic deities have a very broad area of control. So many Celtic deities have several things that they're gods of, whereas maybe in the Roman or Greek pantheon they're a bit more limited. Might be a god of wisdom or a god of warfare or something like that, a bit more limited. But Celtic gods have a very broad spectrum of things that they might control. But all of those things are erased, and you just look at this name and think, okay, god of war, because it's next to Mars. So we lose everything else associated with that deity. So that is a problem. And here's another issue. So these are 3 altars that are found in Housesteads on the Hadrian's Wall, dedicated by cavalrymen that were over. These are auxiliary troops. So the Romans didn't do all their own fighting. They tended to get everybody else to do it for them. For Britain, they got people from Germany, Belgium and Holland, what is now modern Belgium and Holland, to control Hadrian's Wall. So these troops were coming over, and they were thoroughly Romanised by being in the Roman army. They learned Latin and prayed to the Roman gods at certain times, but they were completely allowed to maintain devotions to their own gods. So we do come across god names that we don't know anything else about. So we're coming across, for example, these gods called the Alaesiagai. Now, looking at the top inscription, what do we learn about them? Well, the altar says, to the god Mars and the 2 Alaesiagai. So now, if it's a dedication to Mars and 2 other gods, what kind of dedication might it be? So Mars, we know, is a god of war. I'll read the rest of it. And to the divinity of the emperor, the Germans, being tribesmen of Twente of the Cuneus of Frisians of Vercovicium, styled Severus Alexanders, willingly and deservedly fulfilled their vow. Basically, these Germans are dedicating an altar, having done something that they vowed to do to Mars and the Alaesiagai. Now, what might it be involving?
Killing people.
Yeah, probably. So these might be gods. We might say, okay, we've got a god of war, so presumably these 2 other gods might be gods of war of some kind, because they clearly went out and had a successful campaign, possibly. So let's hold that in our mind. So we've mildly identified these 2 figures as being potentially gods of war from that country. Now, in the second inscription, we get a bit more information about Mars here. To the god Mars Thinxus. Now, that is not a Roman epithet. Does anybody know what a thing is? So this is Germanic, Teutonic / Norse mythology. The god Tiu was the war god, as in Tuesday. Tiu, the war god. He controlled law and order also, and he was the god of the thing. Now, the thing, believe it or not, is the name for an assembly of elders to discuss matters. So Mars Thinxus is Mars, the god of assembly. So they're joining together the god Tiu and Mars as one and the same. So they're sort of giving him a Germanic epithet. And the 2 Alaesiagai, Beda and Fimilena. Oh, we've got names now, and that tells us something else about these 2 deities. What does it tell us? Beda and Fimilena.
Female?
They're female. Yes, they got at the end of their names, which means they are 2 goddesses. And the divinity of the emperor, blah blah blah. They did the same thing, willingly and deservedly fulfilled their vow. So we know a bit more about these 2 gods. We've got their names, and we know something more about Mars and the fact that these gods have been syncretized. And then in the last epithet we have, the last epigram, it starts to get confusing. To the goddesses, okay, that confirms it. the Aliciago, Baldihilia and Friagarbis. We've got completely different names. And the divinity of the emperor, how Fridus gladly and deservedly fulfilled its vow. So this starts to confuse the issue. So this is how difficult it is to pin these gods down. Can anybody posit the problem or the reason why those names might be different?
To different races.
That's right.
Or,
these are different tribes.
Different names for the same.
That's right.
quality.
And I'm thinking, look, you've got Beda and Baldihilia, so they both begin with B, Frigarbis and Fimilena, but at least they begin with F or something. They're the same ladies, but they're in different tribes. So you go about 100 kilometres south, and they're calling them something slightly different because of their accents, their language. So you see, just names change. It's like Lou in Ireland becomes Clú in Welsh. It's still the same god essentially, but the names are slightly different because of the different people, different places. So again, you have to just be aware that they're not, exactly the same names, exactly the same people necessarily, exactly the same functions. We cannot just make assumptions. So this is something to bear in mind. Now, does anybody recognise where this this thing comes from? Bath, yeah? Do you recognise that from Bath? Nope.
So well since been there.
Okay, I thought you'd all. Oh yeah, we know that. So in Bath, the Roman baths at Bath, there is a temple to. You know Sulis Minerva. Again, that's a syncretization. So Sulis being the local deity, Minerva. The Romans go, she's nearest to Minerva. Okay, let's bind them together then. So Aqua Sulis Minerva are the goddesses of Bath. And this has always been called the Gorgon of Bath because of the association with Minerva. Minerva wears a Gorgon plate on her breast. Okay, so in the pediment, this is a small temple with a pediment, and in the middle of the pediment is this image. And it's been called the Gorgon of Bath. Now, what makes it a Gorgon, and does anybody think this is a Gorgon or not? What's the problem with this as a Gorgon?
It depends how you interpret the wiggly bits around it. Is it hair or is it snake?
Well, that's true. Can you see any snakes there?
And it's, well, I don't, but I can see why people might.
Yeah. Okay, look,
There's
that is a snake here. That's a snake there, and there's one here as well. These two are definitely snakes, no doubt about it. So there's a couple of Gorgonist sort of attributes there, but doesn't look like a female to me. It looks like a male. That's right.
May I ask what is the definition of a Gorgon?
Medusa? You know Medusa?
Yes.
Yeah. So she was a Gorgon. So there were 3 Gorgon sisters, and they, turned people to stone. They were originally beautiful, but the myth, they were cursed and had terrible, snake hair and terrible eyes, and their gaze would turn people to stone, that kind of thing.
So they have their origin, what, in Greek mythology?
Yes, Greek mythology. Anyway, the point is that she's associated with Athena stroke Minerva, but this looks like a man. It's possible that the people carving this may have been local, and they've heard the description of the Gorgon, or they've got an image to copy, but they're bringing in other Celtic influences here. And some people have seen Neptune, or I think the most convincing argument I've heard of is someone called Bladud. He was the mythical founder of Bath itself, and he fashioned for himself a pair of wings. So there's the wings there. So I'm wondering, this actually is quite as a mythical founder of Bath who had a pair of wings. I think that's quite convincing. But then you get the snakes involved, and it all becomes a mishmash together. So I think that's quite an exciting and interesting example of the meeting of 2 cultures. So this is the kind of thing we're getting. So to give you an overview then of problems with the evidence, the oral culture of the Celts you mentioned, the syncretization of local deities, the Roman ones, interpreting gods from inscriptions alone, taking Roman accounts of Celts at face value, I mean, that's another one. Actually, really read what the Romans write about the Celts. It's quite funny sometimes. The watering down of gods in Christian texts of Wales and Irish, so they're making them sort of magical beings or something like that. And then the difficulties, the last one, of matching up Bronze Age and Iron Age material culture with myth. So very often you get a story, and then you look in the archaeology for elements of the story, and they don't match. So which one is wrong? You know, clearly the story is not accurate. So an example of that is there was a very clear description of a chariot and all its harnessing, all the rest of it in the story of Cuchulainn of Ireland. And when you look at Bronze Age, Iron Age artifacts, they were not of that type. It's not because the stories were written 6 centuries later. So we have something being described that the bards were seeing at that time, which was not the same as the original Celtic culture. So that's another issue. But I'm really interested in the Iron Age Celts because they're the closest to us, and we know quite a lot about those people and the way that they lived. And I think it's important to, when you try and tap into or understand Celtic religion and Celtic mindset, you have to look at the way they lived and what was around them, what was their landscape like. They didn't have temples. When you go look at Iron Age sites, you don't really find Iron Age or pre-Roman religious areas as such, built structures, temples. They didn't put their gods in a place, because their understanding of the gods were that they were everywhere, all around them in the landscape. They were in the trees, in the fields, in the sky. They worshipped their gods outside, mostly. So the Celtic gods did not need to be housed. They were not. That was not necessary. So you're not finding shrines at all, really, and you're not finding statues or images that much at all. There are occasional small wooden effigies that have survived in water, but this is the other thing to understand, is that if we go back to our map, the Mediterranean world, this is a land of rock and stone. So there's lots of built cities, carving. It's a rocky landscape, and they've got stone everywhere on the surface. Very little earth. That's why they have to move around and find sort of places to grow corn and the rest of it. They build great cities because they have this material to do so. You go to the northern Europe, and these are places of earth, wood and water, and it's a very different landscape. There is not much evident rock on the surface, so that you don't build, if you haven't got it around, you build with what you've got. They build in wood and earth. And that's also, from an archaeologist's point of view, it doesn't survive. It's organic material which decays and is lost. So it's a sort of temporary and a transient sort of culture in that way, is that it doesn't leave these great remains. And that's why they weren't city builders either, because they didn't have need to build in, they didn't sort of urbanise themselves because they weren't building in that way. It was a much more scattered rural culture, but Britain was heavily wooded. That's why they built in their wood. They had plenty of wood for every need that they had. Anyway, let's just an overview of the key themes before we move on. So, key themes when we're thinking about Celtic religion, Celtic ideology, the idea of triadism. So very often you'll see gods in threes. And also the number 3 had great magical significance to the Celtic people. So you'll often see gods triplicated, and there's a reason for this. And also animals bearing 3 horns, or the number 3 coming up in myth very often, simply because it had great magical significance for reasons which we'll discuss later. Therianthropy, now that's from the Greek theron, which means beast, anthropos, which is man. So the shifting between man and beast. So these animal men becoming animal, that shifting between the two. The other world, generally speaking, when talking about the underworld, the Celts didn't think about like Hades, have a Hades idea of it being underground and dark and cavernous and all the rest of it. That was not at all the way they thought of that world. They thought actually it's always termed the other world, and we'll talk about that later. Water as a gateway, the wild hunt, which I think is a little bit of a later idea, but we'll still talk about that, and the association of white animals with the other world. The head cult of the Celts, which is attested and probably happened, because the Celts thought the soul of man resided in the head, so the head was the most important part of the human body. So that's the bit which is speaking, that has the power of speech. You look in someone's eyes and you can sort of see their soul, can't you? So in a sense, the head is the most important part of the body. So they had great value, kept heads. They kept the heads of their enemies, safekeeping. So the heads were important to the cult. So you would see you see exaggerated heads in images and things like that. So we'll talk about that a bit more as well. The idea of magic wands, magic transformations, cauldrons, trees, wells and magical beasts all come up. So these sorts of things come up in the tales, and when you listen to some of these stories, you start to think, oh, that's a bit like Harry Potter, or that's a bit like Tolkien, or that's a bit... And of course, Tolkien and J.K. Rowling got a lot of their ideas from Celtic mythology, and that's wonderful because in a way they're kind of revivifying some of these ideas and tales. And especially Tolkien, when you think about the mythical land in the west where the elves go off to, it's Irish, the Tir na Nog, which is exactly what that is. So just in case you don't know, the calendar of the Celtic year, I mean some of these festivals we still know, they still survive. Yeah, I mean everybody knows the solstices and the equinoxes are quite clear, and then the cross-quarter festivals are the really important ones. So Imbolc, which has just passed, has sort of become Candlemas in the Christian calendar, but this is the traditional time when the ewes start to produce milk, ready for lambing, ready for their lambs. So of course you can imagine that after a hard winter, when you've been eating the same thing day in day out and your stores are running out, that when your sheep start to produce milk, it's the time to celebrate. Wow, we've got something different to eat, they can be nourished again. So your sheep are starting to produce milk, you can make all sorts of things, and we can see that light is returning to the world. And in the ancient calendar, this festival was associated with Brigid or Bridie, certainly with the Irish, and we'll talk about her a bit later as well. So she's associated with the light coming back into the world. And of course that's what Candlemas is all about as well, isn't it? Then past Ostara, Beltane is the next important one. It's May Eve, May Day, and that's your fire festival. It's the traditional start of Celtic summer, and it's the time of lovers. That's what it's all about. But so it's sort of the blessing of all the crops and the animals and all the rest of it, and traditional coming together of people from different tribes so they can make unions and that sort of thing. Then you go past Lether, summer solstice, into Lunasad, and we're going to talk about Lu, the god, the Irish and Welsh god of the sun, among other things. His day is the 1st of August, which is now Lammas or Loafmas in the Christian calendar, and it's interesting actually because it coincides with the first harvest, which is your harvest of your grain, and actually you can almost time it. 1st of August comes and you see the combine harvesters, don't you? And it's still the same now that the wheat tends to get gathered at that time. Even so the first loaves really are made. So that's Loafmas, and then we go past Mabon, which is the name of a god. He's the divine youth, a sort of version of Apollo, and into Samhain, which is modern sort of Halloween, I suppose, All Hallows Eve. And Samhain is what we call the third harvest. So there's 3 harvests. There's the wheat harvest. At Mabon there's the fruit harvest. At Samhain is the animal harvest. So it's the third harvest. So at Samhain, traditionally, you take your animals, you slaughter some of them to salt up and cure for the winter, and then the rest of them you keep through, because you can't feed them all through the winter, it's impossible. So they have to kill some, they have to kill some to eat as well. So they take some of their animals, kill some of them, keep the rest to winter through. Samhain was really important, was the most important of the Celtic calendars. They used to drive their animals between two fires to purify them. And it was also the time of, say, the Celtic New Year. Although some people seem to think that the Celtic New Year starts at summer solstice, which I think is nonsense, really. That's, in the centre as well, quite interesting. There's this idea of the three elements, and they'll come back. They don't seem to include fire in their elements there, but they've got water, earth, and air, and that's important when you get to the tale of Cerridwen, which we'll come to later, equating with body, mind, and soul. I wouldn't put life, death, and rebirth in those places on the wheel. I just turn it round slightly so that death is that side, life is that side, and rebirth is, do you see what I mean? And it needs to be turned a bit, doesn't it? Doesn't make sense otherwise, does it? I don't know who did this, just ignore it. It wasn't me. I disclaim all responsibility. Anyway, to attest, to look at this in antiquity, there is a bit of evidence from France called the Coligny bronze calendar. And this is really useful for us because we can see that you can read this. It's written in Latin, but in the Gallic language, in the Celtic language, and it's looking at how the Celtic calendar came together. It's a 5-year calendar. They call it a lunisolar calendar. So they're trying to put together the phases of the moon and the solar 365 days of the year. But looking at the Celtic way of thinking about it, this is a very lunar way of thinking about it. So let's just try. So here we have 15 days before Atenu. Can you guess what that Atenu might be? The full moon. Yeah, the full moon. And then 15 days or 14 days after, okay, to the next new moon, I suppose, isn't it? Well, so they are looking at your waxing and waning cycles. So if you know anything about lunar law, your waxing calendar, the waxing moon, is your auspicious days for doing things because the energy is growing, everyone's happy. The energy is rising. The waning moon is your inauspicious days, so you don't get married, don't do it, you don't create, you don't make any treaties. They're inauspicious days. Yeah, so they're very, very conscious of what's going on with the moon and when things should be done and all the rest of it. So this is quite important. This is a 2nd century. It's a good piece of evidence for the Celtic calendar, and also there's this Sam here, which they do think is Samhain. Samonios is their name for Samhain. So we have, or Samhain. We have that evidence there for this festival being actually having the same name in that calendar as the start of the year there. So let's look at the pantheons that we've got. So the Welsh god family tree is split into two: the House of Down and the House of Llŷr. Llŷr is the sea, literally the personified sea, and Down is the mother goddess. So we can't possibly cover all of these deities, but these all mostly appear in the Mabinogion. But the ones we are going to look at are, but you see you mentioned Beli there, associated with Down, Arianrod, daughter of Down, Gwydion and Gilvathwy, two very important magicians. Llŷr is the sun god there, and Blodeuwedd is his flower maiden bride who was a bit naughty. And we're going to talk about Rhiannon. You mentioned Pwyll there. He's possibly another underworld lord. He spent some time in the underworld. Anawyddan is another sea lord. He's associated with Manannán of Ireland, who's their sea god. Bran, who lost his head. Branwen, his sister. And then the Irish is even more. I thought I'd put the Irish ones in because we are going to mention them now and again. Sorry it's so tiny, but you couldn't get them all on otherwise. But again, like Dawn, the goddess, the great goddess, we have Danu. So clearly they come from the same root, don't they? Danu is the great goddess, and Bile there as the lord. So they're the same names, same kind of deity. And the Dagda, underneath, is the Irish All-Father. And Nuda here is Nodens, Neath, Lud, which again we see in Britain. There's Lu, the sun god here. He's descended from Baelor. These are kind of titans, Irish titans, that the Fomorians, they had to slay them in the great battle. There's Lear, your sea god here, and Manannán. So very similar names, aren't they, to the sea deities of Wales. And here's Bridie, Bridget. And there are the three deities of Ireland here. See that triplication there? These are all the land deities of Ireland. Bamba, Fola and Eriu. Angus, he's the god of love. And you've got the Morrigan here, the Morrigna. There are three of those as well. The battle goddesses, and Macha is the horse goddess, and Bave next to her. So anyway, so quite a complicated tree, and such a rich mythology.
Throughout the whole of the Celtic world, you would have had, depending on different culture, languages, again, a whole lot of these different family trees.
That's right. You would, but there were parts of them replicated across the Celtic world. So, for example, we know that like Lyons, and that the names of some of the cities in the south of France come from Leith, or which is the same as Nuda. It's the same god essentially, but slightly translated name. So I want to talk about other key Celtic gods of their presence in Britain and Ireland that may have come into this country, but they still had an important presence. So these gods come up in Britain quite popular, and they're widespread across the Celtic world. So I wanted to bring them in as well because they are important. So Taranis, we don't know too much about him, but his altars were widespread, and you can see there he's a sky god, can't you? He's holding a thunderbolt, and he is also associated with the wheel. And many of his votive deposits in graves and sanctuary sites were all wheels. So the wheel in the Celtic world is obviously a solar symbol. So anytime you see a wheel in association with a deity, it symbolises a solar divinity or a sky god. Taranis, I think in Welsh, Taran, I think is still the word for thunder. But he had a much. You think, okay, let's call him Jupiter, or the Romans will probably say, oh, it's Jupiter or whatever. But he had a much more narrow focus than Jupiter. Jupiter really is an all-father, like the Dagda. You know, he does much more than just fire thunderbolts. Whereas Taranis really was just a thunder god. And he did have. The only mythology that we know of Taranis was that he was one of the pantheon who fought the first gods, the Titan type gods. So it's again the clash between the sky and the earth. You know, these chthonic deities for supreme control. So this activity takes place in lots of mythology. So the Irish gods. They go through a series of battles. The Tuatha De Danann, the gods that we're looking at, they fought the Fomori, the Fomorians, the giants of the first age, until they came to a settlement there. The Fomori, the early gods, like the Titans, let's say, they taught the Tuatha De Danann, they taught them the art of farming. So anyway, Taranis, the only thing that we know about Taranis from written sources is from Lucan, and being a Roman source, we can't really credit him with much. But he said, one of these is Taranis, whose worship Lucan describes as crueler than the cult of Scythian Diana, and to whom the Celts offered human sacrifices of people being burnt alive in tree trunks. Now all I can say to that is the Romans can't talk about brutality and sacrifice and things. Yes, so Taranis was often associated with two other gods, and these gods were supposed to be propitiated with human sacrifice. And we know that human sacrifice did occur, and again, it was probably, you're sacrificing your criminals or your thieves or your captives from warfare. You weren't sacrificing your own unless it was a time of great need. But when you understand the Celtic understanding of the afterlife or the other world, there's less horror attached. I'm not sort of saying human sacrifice is a good thing, but because of the way they understood what happened next, it doesn't seem to hold as much horror, wouldn't perhaps for them. And that's why we know that many Aztec lords went to their deaths willingly, because they just didn't fear what was next. It was just a stepping stone to Now the Gundestrup cauldron is a cauldron that was deposited in a bog in Denmark, and it's got some wonderful images on it of Celtic deities. You can identify two for sure, but look at this wonderful mythical landscape of beasts all around as well. So in the centre there, with his hands raised up, again is Taranis, and we know that because of the wheel beside him, and he was always shown in that way. But he has an exaggerated head. So this is very common in Celtic images, that the head is exaggerated, especially of deities, and he's ruling the sky there. We're not really sure about who the little figure is on the left, but another deity for sure. But only certain gods we can identify, luckily, because of their names being written on a Roman altar with that same imagery above. And another of this type is Canales, and he is really significant and important. He came up across the Celtic world, and I've got a little image of him there, seated in a very peaceful position, isn't he? His name literally means the horned one. You see Cern, and the Greek word keros, meaning horn, and Unus one, the horned one. And it possibly, I was thinking actually of Cairn, which is the Cornish name for Cornwall, you know. And I think the Cern Abbas giant. So we do still get the word Cern coming up in this country. So his name was quite well known across the Celtic world, and he is the Lord of all animals. He's always associated with beasts, and he's always stag antlered. His head is bears the antlers of stags, and they were quite significant because they renewed themselves like snakes and snakeskin. So the idea of renewal, rebirth is all associated with the horns of a stag. They drop off and then they. So the idea of shape shifting and renewal is associated with Canales. He's also holding a torque in his right hand, and as well as wearing a torque. And of course, the only people who would wear the torques in Celtic society would be the elites, the warrior elite, and also they would show their gods wearing torques as well. So it shows his sovereignty, lordship over all the animals. And this is important because for Celtic people, they have to manage their animals because they're hunters. So you're managing your woodland, you're managing your animals. You're not killing them all in one big go, and they're not having animals. No, so you need a deity like Canales to continue the life and the flow of prey for you to survive, and your people to survive. So it's understanding nature. All around here you've got little natural symbols. You've got trees and plants. So he may be more than the Lord of beasts. He may also be the lord of the wildwood in terms of trees and plants and everything that's in it. So he is extremely important. But look how serene he is. Now this is not a god of warfare. Yeah, I quite like him actually as a deity. You know, he's a bit spaced out. People have actually equated him with the old Shiva images from, and he has nothing to do with it. But they're very similar. These the early images of Shiva with horns from the east. They're sitting in a very serene way. He's also holding in his other hand a ram's-headed serpent, a ram's horned serpent. Sorry. And again, this is a very unusual creature. It's always associated with Canales, this ram's horned serpent. And when you attach horns to any animal, you increase its potency, its magical potency. So the serpent, like the antlers of the stag, regenerates itself. It's always associated with the underworld, the chthonic in the underworld, but also with healing, as you know, with the serpent around the caduceus. So it has all of these connotations. And the other thing to point out is because the horns are almost identical between the stag on the left and Canales on the right, and he has those the stag has lines sort of on his body, there is an indication that there's a shape shifting going on here, that these are one and the same, that he can be in human form or stag form, so they are the same person. This is I think we'll call it a synoptic narrative, where you have the same person repeated in the same image but in different form. So we see that he is a shapeshifter par excellence.
Is there any connection with Herne?
Yes. Now Herne's an
The
interesting.
hunter?
Yes, that's right. Herne the Hunter. Well, there possibly is, because his name sounds very similar, doesn't it? But Herne the Hunter is a very late medieval sort of semi-pseudo deity. I think Shakespeare picked up on him, but he was associated with sort of actually this area of the country around London, and the sort of the wild hunt, which again is a bit of a later idea. But yeah, I think you can certainly associate Herne and the Cernunnos as a similar kind of type.
Is that? He looks a little bit in a trance. I just wondered, do we have record of shamanic?
Yes, and I was going to talk about that this afternoon, and I think you're absolutely right. It's totally to do with shamanic practice, mushroom eating. And we have two more images of Cernunnos to pick up on. This is from Cirencester. So this is Cernunnos, and he's got apparently his legs are morphing into the snakes, so he's almost becoming these ram's-headed serpents. And above him, by his head, he has two patera, which are these circular dishes full of coins. So later on, the association of Cernunnos is with abundance, financial abundance. And I suppose if you manage your livestock, if you manage it well, it could be quite a lucrative thing. So that's an association there. On the right hand side is a much older image. This is from Valcamonica in Italy, northern Italy, and you see another Cernunnos there. You know that that's a god because his stature is much higher than the little man beside him, offering worship by the looks of things. And so he has the stag's horns. On the left he's got the torque around his arm, you see that? And then on the right is the ram's-headed serpent. So this imagery is all across the Celtic world of this particular deity, and he was, as you see, highly venerated. So Epona, she's a significant horse deity, and she's always shown with two horses, and women were particularly apparently associated with looking after your horses and your horse breeding. So horses in the Celtic world are associated with the elite. So they're like they were in all the Mediterranean cultures actually. So if you owned your horse, you went into battle on your horse, and a horse was also involved in agriculture. They used the horse in all manners of life. So the horse was very important to the welfare and well-being of the tribe. And she's always shown, and she looks like she's holding a pie there, doesn't she? Nice pie. But she's a bestower of plenty, but she protects your horses. And I think she's conflated with Rhiannon in our country. As the horse goddess par excellence here, but we probably think that the white horses, the Uffington one especially, was possibly created in honour of Epona by the Belgae who were a tribe stationed there at the time. So that is Epona. She's synonymous with the horse. She is the horse and she's the goddess of the horse. So she's both. And also, she was that important that there was actually a Roman festival for her on the 18th of December. So she also came into the Roman world. The Romans are quite happy to adopt and integrate deities from other cultures into their own pantheon that they found useful. So the Roman elite cavalrymen also dedicated to Epona. So just two more then. So here are your mothers, the three mothers. If you go to any provincial museum around the country that had a Roman settlement nearby, you'll see these three women. They're everywhere. And they're literally they're a mother goddess triplicated. And the triplism is really for intensification of their power, but also shows the different things that they govern. So we call it augmenting. It shows a different, like the Hindu gods with the different hands. The hands are all showing what the gods control. They might be holding a club, a disc, or whatever. So they're the dominions of the deity. So here we have one holding a baby. You see that? So fertility. And then you got one with a patera, so plenty. And I'm not sure what that thing is in the middle that she's got there. It looks like a scroll, doesn't it, of some kind? Could be learning. Sometimes you see them with a dog. That's the association with the underworld and death, healing as well.
Do they not portray maiden, mother and
Yes,
and the phases of the moon.
Sometimes, quite often the whole maiden mother crone thing is a neo-pagan or it's a later understanding, because very often they're not obvious crones or not obvious. Sometimes you do see obvious ones, the maiden tends to be in the centre very often, and the mother and the crone either side of the maiden. It makes sense, doesn't it, with women, that you're replicating the three stages of womanhood, maiden, mother, crone. But anyway, so yes, the triplism could be all sorts of things. The Trinity, Celtic Trinity, there's a number of possibilities. There's the upper world, this world, and the other world. That tripling, and there's, as you said, the three stages of womanhood. And what have I got here? Life, death, and rebirth. Those sorts of three stages as well. So they could all be symbolised by this tripling. But really, you're looking at the intensification of the power of the deity, as well as showing all their different areas of dominion. Okay. So that's the idea between the tripling there. Again, you see them everywhere. And then we finish with the cucullati because they're really exciting and fun. These are the three dwarfs that started off the talk, and this is another little British stone here. So you have these three little dwarf-like figures in cloaks, and they've got swords there, and they're visiting a seated mother at the end. So sometimes the mothers are shown on their own, sort of like it's almost like the three become one, because we're talking about one deity force expanded into three. We're not talking about three different people. It's important to understand that. It's one force triplicated. These are called genii cucullati, and if you understand the genius of the Romans, it means the spirit of a place. So they are protective deities, and they have a number of functions. They protect, they enhance abundance, they're fertility symbols, but they also aid your passing into the underworld. Because of their cloaked nature, their association with the underworld is also pronounced. So they have a multitude of features, and I think the fact that they are British gods explains the Mac wearing. Yeah, they look like, oh, it's raining again. Yeah, so that actually is what cucullus means. Cucullus means a hooded cloak. If you look it up, it means a little cloak with a hood. So they don't just mean the ones who wear the hooded cloak, cucullati. And also, can you hear a bird in that name? Cucullati, yes. So if you actually look up cucullus or cucullati, you'll get load of pictures of birds, because that is a bird genus of the cuckoo and all the associated birds that go with it. Another interesting thing, though, is that in Germany, in South Germany, there was a tradition until recently that the sound of the cuckoo in the forest was a spirit, the sound of spirits speaking. So there is an interesting sort of a potential spiritual understanding of these entities as being personifications of ancestors, like protective ancestor deities. So that there's possibly an overlap there with the cuckoo, the cucullati. So we're just at the end of our deities that came into England from the Gaulish heartlands, but were popular in Britain, Celtic Britain. And one of them was Rosmerta, preserved by J.K. Rowling as Madame Rosmerta, you may know. But yes, and she was, as her name suggests, a provider and a carer in that sort of, and another kind of a great mother deity again, but more so associated with abundance. She has been sort of twinned with Mercury in a sense, and I was looking for examples of the hieroskamos, which means the divine marriage, where you bring together a god and a goddess to almost amplify each other's qualities or show the different sides of each other's qualities. And it's interesting that there doesn't seem to be any kind of sort of sexual union between these deities. They just simply seem to be coming together for the purpose of amplification of this of their domain, their qualities. So Mercury is the god of commerce, and financial interactions and these sorts of things. So, in that sense, he's a perfect connection to Rosmerta, and would possibly worshipped, in the context of increasing one's abundance through, trade and that sort of thing. So I think it's a conflation of the cults, but they come together. But they aren't a pair. They aren't a sort of sexual pairing. They're sort of amplification of the qualities. And in many of the statues and combinations of them, Rosmerta is shown larger and more important in this country, which you